Before you hear the rest of this story, before we get into the nuts and bolts of how a building can sing a song of its own destruction, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever poured your soul into something, only to watch someone else sign their name to it, I need you to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. It lets me know I'm not just speaking into an empty room, and that stories like this matter. The applause felt like a physical force, a wave of pressure against my skin. It was the kind of sound you'd expect for a rock star, not an architect, but Gage had always been more of a rock star than an architect anyway. He stood on the brightly lit stage, bathed in the adoring glow of the industry's most prestigious award, the Atherton Prize. He held the crystalline obelisk in his hands like he was born to it, his smile a perfect, practiced crescent of magnanimous genius. From my seat in the back of the auditorium, row 34, seat F, I could see the light catch the edges of the award, refracting 1,000 tiny rainbows across his tailored suit. He was a portrait of success, and he was a thief. The building he was being honored for, the New City Museum of Modern Art, wasn't his. It was mine. Every curve of the facade that was meant to evoke a breaking wave, every cantilevered gallery that seemed to defy gravity, every single calculation that made it possible, had come from my mind, my hands, my sleepless nights. I watched him lean into the microphone, the sound of his breathing echoing slightly in the vast hall. My own breath was trapped somewhere in my throat, a hard, painful knot. He started his speech, and the words that came out were a symphony of stolen valor. He spoke of the inspiration, a childhood memory of skipping stones on a lake, a story he'd heard me tell my team during a late-night brainstorming session. He talked about the structural challenges, the impossible physics of the main atrium. He used my exact phrasing from the design proposal, a space that holds its breath, a space that invites silence. My stomach twisted into a cold, dense knot. He thanked the board. He thanked the city. He thanked his senior partners. He thanked his wife for her patience. He even thanked the barista at the coffee shop near the office for keeping him caffeinated. The audience chuckled politely. My name, Juliet Thorne, never left his lips. I was a ghost in the machine I had built. I was just another face in the crowd, clapping on cue, my hands feeling like foreign objects at the ends of my arms. The applause swelled again, a standing ovation this time. I stood with them, a mannequin of support. It was the most surreal, out-of-body experience of my life. I felt the heat of fury flush up my neck, but my face remained a mask of placid professionalism. It had to. In our world, emotion was weakness, and Gage had just taught me how much I couldn't afford to be weak. He saw me, just for a second. His eyes swept the crowd, and for a fleeting moment they met mine. There was no guilt in his gaze, no apology. There was only a flicker of something cold and dismissive, a silent confirmation. This is mine now. You are nothing. A week later, he called me into his glass-walled office. The Atherton Prize sat on his desk, perfectly positioned to catch the morning light. He didn't ask me to sit. He leaned against the edge of his desk, the picture of casual power. He said the board had decided to restructure the junior partnerships. He said my ambition was admirable, but perhaps a little intense for the firm's culture. Too ambitious. The words hung in the air, so absurd, so transparently false, that I almost laughed. Ambitious enough to design your prize-winning museum, but too ambitious to deserve a place at your table. He was firing me, not with the honest brutality of a termination, but with the suffocating, gaslighting language of corporate management. He was forcing my resignation. He slid a folder across the desk, a severance package, a non-disclosure agreement, my erasure, formalized in legalese. I didn't open it. I just looked at him, at the award, at the empire of glass and steel around us that I had helped build. I said, "Thank you for the opportunity, Gage." My voice was even, steady. It was the calmest I had ever felt in my life. It was the calm of a deep, cold ocean, right before the tsunami pulls back from the shore. He made a critical error in his rush to claim my work. You see, in his arrogance, he never bothered to understand it. He saw the beauty, but not the bones. He understood the poetry of the design, but not the physics. And deep in the foundation of that beautiful, impossible building, I had integrated a secret, a signature flaw, a subtle, unique acoustic vulnerability that would only become apparent during the final, most rigorous phase of inspection, a problem that only one person in the world had the proprietary solution to, and that person was me. The drive home from the office that day was a blur. The city lights smeared across my windshield like wet paint. I remember parking my car in the garage beneath my apartment building, and just sitting there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was absolute. In the office there was always noise, the hum of the servers, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of phone calls. It was a soundscape of productivity, of creation. Now there was nothing. The silence felt heavier than any sound. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a decade of my life. I finally got out of the car, my legs feeling unsteady, and took the elevator up to my fourth-floor apartment. The moment I closed the door behind me, the facade I had so carefully maintained for the past week finally crumbled. My bag slid from my shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud. I leaned my back against the door, slid down to the floor, and the sob that escaped me was raw and ugly. It wasn't a quiet, cinematic cry. It was a wrenching, gasping thing that came from a place of profound, hollowed-out shock. My apartment, which was normally my sanctuary, felt like a museum of my own failure. On the coffee table, a scale model of the museum's central atrium sat, a delicate web of balsa wood and acrylic. Against the wall, rolls of blueprints were stacked like cordwood. My entire life was this project. It was the early mornings and the missed dinners. It was the canceled vacations and the strained friendships. It was 3 years of my one and only life, poured into concrete and steel and glass. And in one 10-minute conversation, it had been taken from me. I crawled over to the blueprints and unrolled one of them, the foundation plan. My handwriting was all over it, tiny, precise notes in the margins, complex load calculations, chemical formulas for the concrete aggregate. This was my language. This was the part Gage never looked at. He cared about the sweeping lines, the grand gestures. The foundation, the thing that held it all up, was just plumbing to him, necessary, but unglamorous. He trusted me to handle it, and I did. I handled it perfectly. My fingers traced over a specific section, a series of interconnected chambers embedded within the primary support structures. It looked like a strange geometric honeycomb. To any other engineer, it would seem like an innovative, if eccentric, method of weight distribution. But it was more than that. It was a musical instrument, buried in the earth. My mind flashed back to the beginning, not just of the project, but of my time at the firm. I had arrived 8 years prior, fresh out of my master's program, full of a bright-eyed, naive belief in meritocracy. Gage had been my mentor. At first, it was wonderful. He was brilliant, charismatic, and he saw my potential. He gave me challenging work, pushed me, and championed my ideas. Our first big project together was a corporate headquarters downtown. I was the one who solved the zoning nightmare, finding a loophole in the city code that allowed us to build 20 feet higher than the competition thought possible. In the client meeting, he presented my findings as his own. He said, "I had a breakthrough last night while reviewing the municipal codes." I remember the flicker of surprise, the small, hot prickle of injustice. But I said nothing. I was a junior associate. He was a partner. I told myself it was for the good of the team. That's what you do. You take one for the team. Then it was the pedestrian bridge over the river. The city wanted something iconic, but the budget was impossibly tight. I spent weeks developing a new tension system, using recycled materials, a design that was both beautiful and radically cost-effective. In the press conference announcing our firm had won the contract, he stood at the podium and described the design as if he'd dreamed it up himself. He even used the metaphor I'd used in my pitch to him, a steel harp stringing the two sides of the city together. I was in the back of the room, standing by the coffee station. He caught my eye as he walked off the stage and gave me a small conspiratorial wink, as if to say, "We did it, not you did it. We." The credit was his. The work was ours. It was a slow, creeping erosion of my professional identity. 1,000 little paper cuts that you don't realize are fatal until you're bleeding out on the floor. The museum was supposed to be different. This was my masterpiece. The initial concept came to me in the middle of the night, a sudden, complete vision. I didn't even turn on the lights. I stumbled to my drafting table in the dark and started sketching, my hands moving with a certainty that felt channeled from somewhere else. For 2 years it consumed me. The biggest challenge was the main gallery, a vast, open space, with a ceiling that soared 100 feet, with no visible support columns. Every engineering firm said it was impossible. The physics just didn't work. The load was too great. I remember the day I solved it. I was in my grandfather's old workshop, which I kept in a small storage unit. He had been a luthier, a maker of violins and cellos. The place still smelled of aged maple, pine resin, and varnish. He had taught me about resonance, about how wood could be shaped to amplify or dampen sound. He showed me how a tiny, strategically placed piece of wood, the sound post, could transmit the vibrations of the strings to the entire body of a violin, creating a rich, powerful tone, and how a different placement could create a dissonant, ugly buzz. He called it taming the vibration. Staring at an old cello, leaning against the wall, I had the epiphany. I wouldn't fight the building's inherent stress and vibration. I would tame it. I would channel it. That's when I designed the foundation. It wasn't just a platform to build on. It was an active part of the structural system. The honeycomb chambers weren't for weight distribution. They were resonant cavities. The unique composite material I specified for the concrete wasn't just for strength. It was designed to carry a vibration, a frequency, almost imperceptibly. The entire foundation was designed to absorb the immense stresses from the column-free gallery above and translate them into a stable, harmless, subaudible hum. It was a building that was in a very real sense alive. But there was a catch. The final stage of construction required a series of high-intensity, sonic scans to certify the structural integrity of the concrete. It was standard procedure for a project of this scale, but I knew that when those specific high-frequency waves hit my specific composite material, they would interact with the resonant chambers in a way no one could predict. They would overload the system. The subaudible hum would become an audible, rising, pervasive shriek, a sound that would vibrate through the very steel of the building. It would be a signature flaw, a ghost in the machine that would scream its presence and halt everything. And I had the fix. A proprietary polymer I had developed in parallel, based on my grandfather's old varnish recipes. A viscous, amber-colored liquid that when injected into the resonant chambers at a specific point in the curing process, would perfectly dampen that one exact, problematic frequency. It was the sound post for my concrete violin. Without it, the building was a masterpiece with a fatal, shrieking flaw. With it, it was perfect. I had presented the full design to Gage, minus the explanation of the acoustic flaw and its fix. I'd framed the foundation as a next-generation, dynamic load-bearing system. He loved the buzzwords. He didn't ask questions. He saw a revolutionary design he could put his name on, and his ambition blinded him to the details. He didn't just steal my design. He stole a design he fundamentally did not understand. A ping from my phone cut through the fog of my memory. I wiped my eyes and picked it up. It was a text from Leo. Leo Martinez was a brilliant young structural engineer I had mentored, the same way Gage had once pretended to mentor me. He was quiet, meticulous, and fiercely loyal. Gage had always been dismissive of him, calling him a numbers guy, not a vision guy. Leo had been devastated when I was forced out. The text was short. They poured the first section of the foundation today. Used the C47 aggregate mix, not the C49 you specified. Gage said it was a cost-saving measure. Is that going to be a problem? I stared at the message. C47, cheaper, more common, and acoustically dead. It wouldn't carry the vibration properly. My system, my elegant, dangerous system, wouldn't work. For a moment, a wave of pure, hot panic washed over me. He was inadvertently neutralizing my trap. But then a cold, clear thought cut through the noise. Of course he changed it. Gage always cut corners where he thought it wouldn't show. But he only changed it for the first section. There were 6 more to pour. He didn't know why the C49 was specified. He just saw a line item that was 15% more expensive. I typed back. Don't worry about it, Leo. Just keep me posted on the pour schedule for the other sections. And be careful. The despair that had been crushing me began to recede, replaced by something else. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years. It was the same feeling I got when I stared at an impossible engineering problem. The thrill of knowing a solution existed, if only I was smart enough to find it. This was just a new kind of problem. My life's work hadn't been stolen. It had been taken hostage, and I was the only one who could negotiate its release. I stood up, my knees cracking. I walked over to the blueprints, rolled them up tightly, and secured them with a rubber band. I wasn't going to let him break me. I was going to let him break himself. I looked at the little balsa wood model of the atrium, the space that was meant to hold its breath. I thought, you just hold on, I'm coming for you. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about making things right. It was about signing my name to my work, one way or another. The days that followed my forced resignation were a strange sort of limbo. I woke up every morning at 6 a.m., my body still programmed to the rhythm of deadlines and early morning site visits. But there was nowhere to go. The silence in my apartment was a constant reminder of my new, unmoored reality. I spent the first week in a fugue state, applying for jobs I didn't want at firms I didn't respect. The interviews were a humiliating dance. They all knew Gage. They all knew of his Atherton Prize. When they asked why I left his firm at the height of its greatest triumph, I had to offer vague, corporate-speak answers about seeking new challenges. They would nod, their eyes betraying a hint of suspicion. Was I difficult? A problem? The stigma of being too ambitious was a shadow that followed me. But beneath the surface of this aimless despair, a new machine was whirring to life. The first thing I did was call Elena. Elena Garza and I had been roommates in college, 2 scholarship kids trying to conquer worlds that weren't built for us. Her in law, me in architecture. While I was building structures of steel and glass, she was building them out of precedents and statutes. She was now a partner at a boutique intellectual property firm, sharp as a shard of glass, and twice as dangerous in a negotiation. I met her at a sterile coffee shop halfway between our apartments. I laid out the whole story. The stolen credit, the forced resignation, the acoustic flaw, the polymer. I expected a lecture on my naivete, on not protecting myself sooner. Instead, she just listened, her gaze intense. When I finished, she took a slow sip of her latte. She said, "So let me get this straight. You designed a brilliant, proprietary structural system. You also designed the proprietary key to a fatal flaw within that system. And the man who stole your work has no idea that the lock and key even exist." I nodded, feeling a little foolish. It sounded like something out of a spy novel when she said it like that. Elena's lips curved into a slow, predatory smile. "Juliet," she said, "this isn't a disaster. This is leverage. This is the most beautiful case of industrial poetic justice I have ever seen." Over the next 2 weeks, Elena worked with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. The first order of business was my LLC. I had formed 1 year ago, a shell company I used for some freelance consulting work I'd done in grad school. It was called Resonance Structures. It had been dormant for years. Elena reactivated it, cleaned up the paperwork, and made it an ironclad legal entity. The next step was the patent for my polymer. I had all my research, my notebooks filled with chemical compositions, the records of my experiments inspired by my grandfather's varnishes. The story of its origin, the connection to the luthier's art, was not just a sentimental detail. Elena said it was a powerful part of establishing its unique, non-obvious nature, a key component of patent law. We filed an expedited patent application. It was expensive, but it was the entire foundation of the plan. I drained my savings to cover the legal and filing fees. It was a huge gamble. It was everything I had. While Elena built the legal fortress, I focused on the technical front. The problem of the C47 aggregate gauge had used in the first pour was a serious one. My trap wouldn't work if the foundation couldn't carry the vibration. I spent 3 days locked in my apartment, running simulations on my high-powered workstation. It was like I was back in the firm, but this time the client was me. I needed to find a way to make the plan work with the compromised material. I called Leo. I couldn't tell him everything, of course. I couldn't risk implicating him. I framed it as a theoretical problem. I said, "Leo, I'm working on a thought experiment for a competition. If you had a foundation with 6 sections, and the first section was poured with an acoustically inert aggregate, but the remaining 5 were poured with a highly resonant composite, could you still create a harmonic cascade across the entire structure? If you, say, amplified the frequency in section 3. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Leo was smart. He knew this wasn't a thought experiment. He just said, "You'd have to create a sympathetic resonance bridge. You'd need to introduce a third element, something to link the dead section to the live ones. It would be tricky. You'd need to know the exact pour schedule, the curing times, the ambient temperature of the concrete." He was talking, but the subtext was clear. "I can get you that information." This began our secret correspondence. Leo became my field operative. He would send me encrypted messages with site reports, photos of the rebar layouts, updates on Gage's increasingly erratic behavior. Gage was apparently swanning around the site, wearing a pristine white hard hat he never got dirty, pointing at things, and using architectural jargon incorrectly. The construction crews, men who had been pouring concrete their whole lives, were starting to talk. They knew a fraud when they saw one. Leo told me Gage had demanded they speed up the pour schedule. He wanted to get to the pretty parts of the building, the facade and the interior. He was rushing the foundation. He was rushing towards his own doom. Armed with Leo's data, I recalibrated my plan. The solution was an additive, a small amount of powdered tungsten to be mixed into the C49 composite for section 3. The density of the tungsten would act as an amplifier, a tuning fork that would kickstart the vibration with enough force to bridge the dead zone of section 1. It was an even more elegant, more audacious solution than my original design. It required a level of precision that Gage, with his cost-cutting and corner clipping, would never even conceive of. The problem was how to get the tungsten into the mix. I couldn't just walk onto the site with a bag of metal powder. This is where Mrs. Albright came in. Eleanor Albright was the grand dame of the city's art scene and the head of the museum's acquisitions committee. She was in her late 70s, with eyes that missed nothing. Early in the design phase, before Gage had completely sidelined me, I had a 2-hour meeting with her alone. We didn't talk about budgets or timelines. We talked about art. We talked about how the light in a gallery can change the feeling of a painting, how the ambient sound of a room can affect the way you experience a sculpture. I told her my vision for the museum, a building that was not just a container for art, but an active participant in its display. I told her about my grandfather, the luthier. She was captivated. She told me, "My dear, you are not an architect, you are a composer." After that meeting, Gage made sure I never met with a board member alone again. I found her email address through a public donor listing. I composed the email 100 times. It had to be perfect, not an accusation, not a plea for help. It was a professional follow-up. Subject: acoustic integrity of the main gallery. Dear Mrs. Albright, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to you today in a private capacity. During our conversation 2 years ago, we discussed the unique acoustic properties planned for the main gallery spaces. I have since developed a proprietary material treatment, a damping polymer, that I believe is essential to achieving the intended sonic environment we discussed. Given my departure from the firm, I am uncertain if the current team is aware of the final specifications for this system. If the board is interested, my company, Resonant Structures LLC, would be happy to provide a consultation. Sincerely, Juliet Thorne. It was formal, professional, and planted a seed of doubt. It established my intellectual ownership of a key concept, and it gave her a breadcrumb to follow. I hit send, my heart pounding. For 2 days there was nothing. I started to think it was a mistake, that she had deleted it, or forwarded it straight to Gage. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, I received a one-line reply. Miss Thorne, your timing is impeccable. Please expect a call. The foresight wasn't just about the flaw and the fix. It was about understanding the people. Gage understood power, but he didn't understand loyalty. He didn't understand the quiet integrity of a man like Leo, or the discerning wisdom of a woman like Mrs. Albright. He had built his career on a foundation of stolen ideas and hollow charisma. I had built mine on real relationships and meticulous, undeniable work. His foundation was about to crack. Mine was about to sing. The call came 2 weeks later. It wasn't from Mrs. Albright. It was from Leo. His voice was a hushed, urgent whisper. Juliet, it's happening. They finished the final integrity scans this morning. I felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. I asked, and it's a disaster, he said. There's a sound. It started about an hour ago. It's high, eerie. You can feel it in your teeth. They've shut down the whole site. I closed my eyes, picturing it. The empty construction site, the half-finished skeleton of my museum, and at its heart, a single piercing note, vibrating out from the earth. My ghost in the machine was awake. What's Gage doing? I asked. He's losing his mind, Leo said, a note of dark satisfaction in his voice. He's been yelling at the lead engineer for an hour. He brought in an acoustics team from a soundproofing company. They're walking around with microphones, looking completely baffled. They think it's a groundwater pump or a faulty transformer somewhere. They have no idea it's the building itself. This was the moment. The silent, invisible tripwire had been crossed. From this point forward, every action Gage took would only dig his hole deeper. He would look for an external cause, a mechanical failure, because his ego would not allow him to consider the possibility that the flaw was inherent to the design he had claimed as his own. His ignorance was now my greatest weapon. The news of the delay broke a few days later. It started as a small article in the business section of the local paper. Mysterious setback halts construction on new art museum. The official statement from Gage's firm was a masterpiece of corporate evasion, citing unforeseen subsurface geotechnical complications. They were buying time, but time was on my side. I gave it a week for the panic to set in, a week for the board to grow impatient, and for the media to start asking more pointed questions. Leo's updates became a running commentary on Gage's professional meltdown. He was becoming paranoid, accusing his own team of sabotage. He was holding endless, frantic meetings, demanding solutions that no one could provide. The project was bleeding money every day it sat idle. The star architect was looking less like a star and more like a black hole. Then, I made my move. It wasn't a press conference or an angry expose. It was an email. A single, perfectly crafted email from Elena's office to the museum's board of directors, with a carbon copy sent directly to Mrs. Albright's personal address. The sender was not Juliet Thorne. The sender was Resonant Structures, LLC. The email was brief and clinical. It stated that our firm specialized in resolving complex acoustic structural anomalies in large-scale composite structures. It referenced a proprietary, patent-pending polymer solution, RS-17, designed specifically to mitigate harmonic resonance in dynamic load-bearing foundations. It noted that we had observed the public reports of the delay at the museum site and believed our technology could offer a definitive solution. We were available for consultation at our earliest convenience. It concluded with a link to our newly launched minimalist website, which featured technical white papers on acoustic dampening and the chemical theory behind the polymer. There was no mention of Gage, no mention of his firm, no mention of me. It was a clean, surgical strike. It was a hand reaching out of the darkness, offering the only key to the only lock. The response was faster than I could have imagined. Less than 24 hours later, Elena received a call from the board's legal counsel. They wanted a meeting, Immediately, Gage's panic, as relayed by Leo, reached a fever pitch. He had been blindsided. A small, unknown company had just claimed to have the solution to a problem he couldn't even identify. He started an internal investigation to find out who Resonant Structures was. He was chasing a ghost, and he had no idea that the ghost used to sit in an office just down the hall from his. The beauty of the plan was its silence. I wasn't attacking him. I was offering a solution to the client he was failing. I wasn't accusing him of theft. I was demonstrating his incompetence. The board, as a group of fiduciarily responsible individuals, had no choice but to follow the lead. Their loyalty was not to Gage. It was to the museum, to the 9-figure investment that was currently sitting inert and screaming a single high-pitched note of failure. I spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing, not for a fight, but for a presentation. I assembled a dossier, the patent filings for the polymer, the simulation data showing the cause of the hum, the recalibrated plan involving the tungsten powder, and the precise injection protocol for the fix. This wasn't about drama, it was about competence. My power wasn't in what I could say about Gage. It was in what I could do that he couldn't. I was preparing to be the calm, professional, undeniable solution to a problem that was driving everyone else to madness. It was a quiet coup, executed, not with a bang, but with a hum. And the silence that would follow would be the sound of my victory. The board meeting was held in a sterile, impersonal conference room at the offices of the museum's lawyers. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the massive mahogany table sat the board of directors, a collection of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures, their faces grim. At the head of the table sat Mrs. Albright, her expression unreadable. On the other side sat Gage. He looked smaller than he did on the awards stage, his tailored suit seeming to hang off him. His face was pale, his usual charismatic confidence replaced by a brittle, defensive energy. My lawyer Elena and I sat at the far end of the table, positioned as outside consultants. I was introduced simply as Juliet Thorne, the lead engineer for Resonant Structures. When Gage saw me walk in, the color drained from his face. It was a flicker, a momentary loss of composure, but in that silent, charged room, it was as loud as a scream. He knew. In that instant, he understood the full, elegant horror of the trap he was in. The meeting began. The board's chairman, a severe-looking man named Mr. Harrington, laid out the situation in stark terms. The project was 3 weeks behind schedule, hemorrhaging money, and their lead architect had no viable explanation or solution for the crippling structural flaw. He then turned the floor over to Gage. Gage stood up, shuffling his papers. He launched into a torrent of technical jargon and excuses. He talked about anomalous soil resonance, sympathetic vibrations from a nearby subway line, even suggesting a form of industrial sabotage. It was a masterclass in blame shifting, a desperate attempt to create a fog of complexity, to hide his own ignorance. The board members listened, their expressions moving from impatient to incredulous. Mrs. Albright simply watched him, her hands folded on the table, her silence more damning than any accusation. When he finally ran out of steam, Mr. Harrington turned to me. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice flat, "your company claims to have a solution. Please enlighten us." I didn't stand up. I remained seated, projecting a calm that I did not entirely feel. Elena slid a tablet in front of me. With a tap, the large screen at the end of the room lit up. It showed a 3D model of the museum's foundation. "The problem is not in the soil, or the subway," I began, my voice even and clear. "The problem is the foundation itself. It was designed to translate structural load into a subaudible harmonic frequency. It is, by design, an acoustic system." I walked them through it. The resonant chambers, the C49 composite, the principle of tamed vibration. I explained how the final integrity scans had overloaded the system, creating the audible hum. I never said, "the design I created." I simply said the design. The implication was clear. This was the fundamental nature of the building, and their star architect had been completely unaware of it. Then I brought up the solution. The RS-17 polymer. I showed them the patent filings. I showed them the simulation data. A green wave of stability, overriding the red wave of chaotic vibration. I explained the injection process, the need for the tungsten additive in Section 3 to bridge the C47 aggregate that had been mistakenly used in the first pour. This was the kill shot. I had just revealed a critical error in project management, a cost-cutting measure that had compromised the entire structure, and I did it as a clinical side note, a problem that my elegant solution had already accounted for. Gage flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He had been exposed not just as an ignorant fraud, but an incompetent one. There was a long silence when I finished. The board members looked from the screen, to me, and then to Gage. The spell was broken. The Emperor had no clothes. Mrs. Albright finally spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight. "Mr. Gage," she said, not looking at him, but at the screen. "Did you understand that this was how the foundation you took credit for actually worked?" Gage opened his mouth, then closed it. The bravado was gone. He was a cornered animal. He stammered something about proprietary associate designs, about needing to review the final specs. It was over. He had no answer. And Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. "Mr. Gage, we are suspending your firm's contract, effective immediately pending a full review. Thank you for your time." It was a brutal, swift execution. Gage just stood there for a moment, stunned. Then he gathered his papers, his hands trembling slightly, and walked out of the room without another word. The power shift was complete. It had happened not in a shouting match, but in a quiet, sterile room, with a PowerPoint presentation and a series of undeniable facts. The door clicked shut behind him, and the tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of focused urgency. Mr. Harrington looked at me. "Miss Thorne, Resonant Structures, let's talk about your contract." The call I had been half expecting came 2 days later. It was Gage. His voice was unrecognizable. The booming, confident baritone was gone, replaced by a strained, pleading tone. "Juliet," he said, "we need to talk." I was in my apartment, looking at the balsa wood model of the atrium. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching a movie of my own life. "There's nothing to talk about, Gage," I said calmly. "The board has made its decision." He started to babble. An offer. He would make me a full senior partner, no vesting period. He would give me public credit, a press conference announcing me as the co-designer. He would double my salary. The desperation rolled off him in waves. It was everything I had once wanted, and now it was utterly worthless. "It's too late for that," I said. Then his tone shifted. The pleading vanished, replaced by a snarl of his old arrogance. He threatened to sue me. He would sue me for industrial sabotage, for stealing intellectual property, for violating my non-disclosure agreement. He would bury me in legal fees until I was bankrupt. This was the Gage I knew. When cornered, he attacked, but I was ready. "You can't sue me for sabotage, Gage," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "The flaw isn't a flaw. It's an undocumented feature of a design you claim to understand. My solution, the polymer, was developed after my employment ended. It is the sole property of my company, protected by a patent that is, as of this morning, fully granted." Elena had called me an hour before. The patent was official. Checkmate. "As for my NDA," I continued, "I haven't disclosed anything. I haven't spoken to the press. I haven't told the board you're a fraud. I simply presented a solution to a technical problem, a problem that occurred on your watch, with a design you put your name on. If you sue me, all of this will become public record during discovery. The depositions, the design history, your emails, everything. Is that what you want?" There was a long, ragged silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, heavy and defeated. I had built a fortress, not of emotion, but of logic and law. He had no way in. "You were right about one thing, Gage," I said, unable to resist twisting the knife just a little. "You said I was too ambitious. I suppose you just weren't ambitious enough to do your homework." I hung up the phone. It was the last time we ever spoke. The final confrontation wasn't a confrontation at all. It was a formality. I was in the same boardroom a week later, but this time, Gage wasn't there. I was sitting at the main table with Elena, across from Mr. Harrington and Mrs. Albright. The contract was in front of me. It named Resonant Structures, LLC as the lead architectural and engineering consultant for the remainder of the project. It gave me full creative and technical control. My new title was Architect of Record. I signed my name, Juliet Thorne, on the signature line. The stroke of the pen felt solid, real. It was an anchor, fixing my identity to my work. Finally and irrevocably, my first day back on the construction site was surreal. The silence was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of work. The crew, who had been idle for weeks, was back. When I walked onto the site, wearing a brand new hard hat with my new company's logo on it, the foreman, a burly man named Sal, came over to me. He had been a vocal critic of Gage's incompetence. He just looked at me, then at the foundation, and said, "So you're the one who knows how to make the noise stop?" I nodded. "I'm the one," I said. He grunted, a sound of grudging respect. "Good," he said. "Let's get to work." Leo was by my side, promoted to my lead engineer. The look of quiet, triumphant pride on his face was more gratifying than any award. Together, we supervised the injection of the RS-17 polymer. It was a slow, meticulous process, drilling into the concrete and pumping the viscous amber liquid into the resonant chambers. It felt like I was healing a wound. We started with Section 3, with the tungsten-laced concrete. Then we moved through the other sections. As we finished the final injection, a profound silence began to settle over the site. The high, piercing hum that had haunted the project for a month faded, not abruptly, but gently, like a musical note held until it runs out of breath. The building was finally quiet. The stillness was absolute. It was the sound of a perfectly tuned instrument, at rest. A few weeks later, an article appeared in a major architectural journal. Here one major architectural journal. Here one major architectural journal. Here one major archsid and Nivalve. Here one major archsid done wed. It announced that Gage's firm had been removed from the museum project, and that a specialist engineering group, Resonant Structures, led by a former associate, Juliet Thorne, had been brought in to resolve a critical, previously undiscovered structural issue. It mentioned Gage was taking an extended leave of absence for personal reasons. It was the kind of quiet, professional language used to describe a public execution. His career wasn't just over, it was a cautionary tale. The Atherton Prize, once his crowning achievement, was now a monument to his fraud. I stood in the main atrium of the nearly finished museum. Sunlight streamed through the vast, unsupported glass ceiling, dappling the polished concrete floor. The space held its breath, just as I had designed it to. It was silent, peaceful, and perfect. I had done more than just reclaim my project. I had built a new reality for myself, one where competence was the only currency that mattered, and where my name was signed, indelibly, on the work of my own hands. I had not set out for revenge. I had set out for vindication, and in the quiet of that sun-drenched atrium, I had found it. 6 months later, the City Museum of Modern Art opened to the public. The opening night gala was an even grander affair than the awards ceremony where my nightmare had begun. This time, I wasn't in the back of the auditorium. I was on the stage, standing at the podium, with Mrs. Albright by my side. The lights were just as bright, the applause just as loud, but this time, they were for me. I looked out at the sea of faces, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the despair, the cold resolve, the quiet, meticulous planning. I thought about my grandfather and his violins. In my speech, I didn't mention Gage. I didn't talk about the struggle. I talked about the building. I talked about the idea of a structure that was alive, that responded to the world around it. I told them about a luthier who taught me that the most beautiful things are often a result of perfectly controlled, perfectly understood tension. At the end of the night, Mrs. Albright took me to a quiet corner near the main entrance. On the wall, next to the large donor plaque, was a smaller, more discreet one. It was brushed steel, with simple, elegant lettering. It read Architectural and Structural Engineering by Juliet Thorne, Resonant Structures. My name, my company, my work. It was all there. It was real. And now, I'm talking to you. I'm sitting in my new office, the office of the founder and principal of a firm that is now one of the most sought after in the country for complex and challenging projects. The balsa wood model of the museum sits on my credenza. It's a reminder, not of the betrayal, but of the fact that the most solid foundations are the ones you build yourself. They will tell you that you are too ambitious. What they mean is that you are too threatening. They will tell you to wait your turn. What they mean is that they hope your turn never comes. They will try to erase your name and write their own over it. Do not let them. Your work, your ideas, your soul, that is your property. You do not need their permission to claim it. Sometimes, protecting your work doesn't mean shouting from the rooftops. It means building a better, smarter, more resilient structure. It means understanding the physics of your own value so completely that when they try to steal the credit, they are left holding a beautiful, hollow, and fatally flawed thing that only you know how to fix. It was never about revenge. It was about resonance. It was about making the world vibrate at the frequency of the truth. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people looking right at you, let me know in the comments below. Your stories give me strength. And please, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for listening.